Imagine for a moment opening a dusty ledger in a provincial church archive, your fingers tracing down columns of burial records from the 1820s, and suddenly stopping at an entry that makes your blood run cold. Body interred without head, cause unknown, no investigation conducted. Then another. And another, dozens of them, scattered across parishes separated by hundreds of miles, all dating to the same narrow window of years, all recorded with the same bureaucratic indifference, as if burying headless corpses were as routine as recording a farmer's death from pneumonia. This wasn't the work of a single madman or an isolated crime. This was something systematic, something that reached across nations and continents, leaving behind a paper trail that historians have spent 2 centuries trying to ignore. Because when you start pulling at this thread, when you begin asking why entire generations were buried without their heads in the 19th century, you don't just uncover a medical curiosity or a macabre fashion. You stumble into something far more disturbing, evidence of a civilization-wide crisis that someone desperately wanted erased from collective memory. The world of the early 1800s was a place of profound contradictions that should make any thinking person pause and question the narrative we've been fed. Walk through the streets of St. Petersburg or Philadelphia in 1820, and you'd find yourself surrounded by architectural marvels that modern engineers admit they couldn't replicate without computer modeling and advanced materials. Massive granite columns weighing dozens of tons, transported hundreds of miles and erected with mathematical precision. Underground drainage systems that still function flawlessly 2 centuries later, built with engineering tolerances that supposedly primitive societies had no business achieving. Gaslighting systems illuminating entire districts when the official story tells us people were just learning to harness steam power. Yet simultaneously, these same societies that could build structures rivaling modern skyscrapers supposedly struggled with basic hygiene, couldn't prevent cholera outbreaks, and kept their populations in near-medieval squalor. The wealthy inhabited palatial estates with hot running water, sophisticated ventilation systems, and architectural features that wouldn't appear in mainstream construction for another 100 years, while official history insists the Industrial Revolution was just beginning to transform human capability. Something about this picture doesn't add up. Either our ancestors were selectively brilliant, able to perform engineering miracles while somehow remaining ignorant of fundamental sciences, or we're looking at the remnants of something much older, much more advanced, slowly decaying as a new, diminished population tried to occupy spaces they didn't fully understand. The headless burials began appearing in church records and municipal documents around 1815, right after a period that official history glosses over with remarkable speed. The previous decades had witnessed what historians call the Napoleonic Wars, but the scale of destruction, the demographic collapse, the complete reorganization of European society goes far beyond what any conventional military conflict could explain. Entire cities were rebuilt. Populations were relocated en masse. Old noble families disappeared overnight, replaced by new lineages with suspiciously complete documentation and conveniently ancient pedigrees. And in the midst of this chaos, bodies started appearing without heads. The official explanations, when they bothered to offer any, ranged from the absurd to the deliberately vague. Medical schools conducting unauthorized dissections, grave robbers seeking anatomical specimens, victims of robbery gone wrong, religious fanatics performing bizarre rituals. But none of these explanations account for the patterns. The headless burials weren't random. They clustered in specific regions, appeared during specific years, and then stopped just as mysteriously as they'd begun, usually around 1830 or 1840, depending on the location. And they weren't limited to paupers or criminals. Parish records show wealthy merchants, minor nobility, even clergy receiving headless burials with full funeral rites, their families apparently accepting this mutilation as normal, as expected, as if removing heads before burial was simply what one did during that particular decade. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Contemporary accounts, when you can find them buried in provincial archives and private correspondence that escaped later sanitization, paint a picture far stranger than simple grave desecration. A German physician writing in 1823 describes being called to examine a body discovered in a field outside Munich. The corpse was fresh, perhaps dead only hours, yet already decapitated with surgical precision. The doctor notes that the removal of the head was performed with skill exceeding anything he'd witnessed in medical school, the cervical vertebrae separated cleanly without splintering, the surrounding tissue showing cuts that could only have been made with extraordinarily sharp instruments. He writes with obvious distress that he'd seen similar cases a dozen times in the past year, always in rural areas, always bodies of individuals who'd disappeared weeks earlier, and always with the same impossible precision in the decapitation. But here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. This same physician mentions something else in his journal, something that made me stop and reread the passage 3 times to ensure I understood correctly. He describes examining the body's bone structure and noting peculiarities that troubled him deeply. The skeleton was larger than normal. The skull measurements, before it was removed, suggested cranial capacity significantly exceeding typical human dimensions, and the general proportions were what he termed archaic, as if the body belonged to someone from a much earlier period of human development. He wondered in his notes whether he was looking at evidence of what he called the old stock, a phrase he doesn't elaborate on, as if his readers would understand what he meant, as if everyone in 1823 knew there were different types of humans, different genetic lineages, and that one of them was systematically having their heads removed after death. Cross-reference this with similar accounts from England, France, the newly formed American states, and even reports from colonial administrators in India and South America, and a pattern emerges that official history seems desperate to ignore. The headless burials correlate almost perfectly with regions undergoing rapid demographic shifts following the massive upheavals of the early 1800s, areas where old populations seemingly vanished overnight, replaced by people whose origins remain mysteriously vague in official records, cities where entire districts were demolished and rebuilt within impossibly short timeframes, with authorities claiming fire damage or plague necessitated the reconstruction. Yet the archaeological evidence shows something quite different. Buildings deliberately buried under tons of earth, streets elevated by 10 or 15 feet, ground floors of structures converted into basements with new construction placed on top, as if someone were quite literally covering up the previous civilization. The sheer scale of these burial operations defies the explanation that this was merely grave robbery or medical school activity. Parish records from rural England document cases where entire family crypts were opened years after burial, only to discover every single body had been decapitated post-interment. Someone had entered sealed burial chambers, removed the heads from decomposing corpses, and then carefully resealed everything. The effort required, the organization, the systematic nature of these violations suggests official sanction, suggests this was policy, not crime, and yet no government documents acknowledge it, no public health orders explain it, no police investigations prosecuted it. The headless burials were happening in plain sight, recorded in official ledgers, witnessed by clergy and municipal authorities, and absolutely no one in power seemed to think it required explanation. Consider the technological paradox this presents. These same societies that supposedly couldn't prevent cholera because they didn't understand germ theory were capable of organizing covert operations across multiple continents, infiltrating burial grounds, performing surgical-quality decapitations, and maintaining absolute silence about their activities. They possessed sharp enough instruments to cut through bone cleanly, operated in darkness or underground with sufficient lighting and precision to work on decomposing bodies, and coordinated their efforts across regions that should have had minimal communication given the official technological level of the era, unless, of course, the official technological level is a lie. Unless the early 1800s possessed communication systems, transportation networks, and organizational capabilities that we've been told didn't exist until much later. The instruments themselves raise profound questions that archaeological evidence refuses to adequately address. To separate a human head from the body with the precision described in medical reports requires tools of exceptional sharpness and metallurgical quality. We're not talking about crude axes or saws that would leave jagged edges and splintered bone. Contemporary physicians consistently described cuts so clean they appeared almost polished, edges so precise they suggested instruments far superior to anything officially available in that era. Some accounts mention finding bodies where the decapitation had been performed with such skill that it appeared the head had simply been lifted away, the surrounding tissue showing no tearing or bruising, as if whatever cut through flesh and bone did so with molecular precision. What kind of civilization possessed such technology but left no trace of these instruments in museum collections or archaeological excavations. Now layer onto this the curious fact that many regions experiencing headless burials also show evidence of massive fire damage in the preceding decades. Not localized fires from accidents or warfare, but conflagrations that consumed entire urban centers, leaving behind patterns of destruction that experts have noted don't match typical building fires. The heat required to melt certain materials found in the rubble, the uniform distribution of ash layers, the strange absence of expected artifacts from the period, all point to something more catastrophic than conventional fires. Some researchers have proposed these were the results of deliberate destruction, a systematic erasure of physical evidence from whatever existed before the early 1800s reset everything. Examine the fire patterns more closely, and anomalies multiply. Cities that supposedly burned due to wooden construction show melted stone and vitrified brick, materials that require temperatures far exceeding what wood fires produce. The distribution of heat damage suggests not spreading flames but simultaneous ignition across wide areas, as if the entire city had been subjected to intense thermal energy from above rather than fires starting from discrete points and spreading. Insurance records, where they survive, document property losses that bankrupted entire financial institutions, yet reconstruction proceeded with suspicious speed, funded by sources that official records either don't identify or attribute to vague international investors who appeared precisely when needed and vanished once the rebuilding was complete. The demographic data, what little survives, is equally bizarre. Census records from the early 19th century show population numbers that fluctuate wildly, sometimes doubling or halving within a single decade, in ways that no combination of plague, famine, or warfare adequately explains. Mortality rates that should have caused societal collapse are recorded alongside booming construction projects and expanding economies. It's as if two different populations existed simultaneously, one dying off in massive numbers, another appearing from nowhere to replace them. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. Perhaps the headless burials were a systematic attempt to erase physical evidence of the previous inhabitants, to remove the most identifiable remains, the skulls that might reveal through future analysis that these weren't quite the same species, or at least not the same genetic lineage, as the populations that replaced them. The genealogical records from this period present their own set of impossibilities. Families that had maintained detailed lineages for centuries suddenly restart their documentation around 1800 or 1810, as if everything before that point had been lost or deliberately destroyed. Aristocratic houses with traceable ancestry going back to medieval times abruptly produce new family trees with conveniently complete documentation, but suspicious gaps in the transitional period. Immigration records show massive population movements that official history attributes to economic opportunity or political upheaval, yet when you examine the details, these migrants often arrive with no documentation of origin, no traceable history beyond the moment they appeared in their new location, as if they'd materialized fully formed rather than traveled from somewhere else. Because here's the question no mainstream historian wants to address: why specifically remove the heads? If this were merely grave robbery for anatomical specimens, thieves would take whole bodies or specific organs. If this were some bizarre religious practice, we'd find contemporary documentation, theological justifications, records of the belief system that demanded it. If this were evidence of serial killers or criminal activity, we'd see investigations, arrests, public outcry. Instead, we have silence, systematic, coordinated silence across multiple nations and continents, as if removing heads from the dead was something that needed to happen but couldn't be publicly acknowledged, as if those heads contained information that would shatter the carefully constructed narrative about human history and civilization's development. The architectural evidence compounds the mystery. Visit any major city founded or significantly rebuilt in the early 1800s, and you'll notice something odd about the oldest structures. They're built to a scale that doesn't quite match the human populations that supposedly inhabited them. Doorways tall enough that average people look like children. Ceilings in residential buildings reaching heights that serve no practical purpose for heating or comfort. Furniture, when original pieces survive, sized for individuals considerably larger than historical records claim existed. The official explanation is that architectural fashion favored grand proportions, that people simply liked tall rooms and large doorways. But apply this explanation to tens of thousands of buildings across multiple continents, all built within a few decades of each other, and it starts to sound less like fashion and more like these structures were designed for different inhabitants whose physical dimensions exceeded those of the populations that came after. Study the surviving furniture from pre-1800 estates, the pieces that haven't been destroyed or relegated to storage where the public won't examine them too closely, and you'll find chairs with seat heights that would leave modern humans' feet dangling, beds of such length and width They seem designed for individuals 7 or 8 feet tall, dining tables at heights that would require contemporary users to stand rather than sit comfortably. Museums curate these pieces carefully, often displaying them in ways that obscure their true scale, positioning them in large rooms where their proportions seem less jarring, rarely allowing detailed measurements or comparative analysis with modern furniture. When researchers do manage to document these anomalies, their findings are dismissed as outliers, custom pieces made for unusually tall individuals, exceptions that prove nothing about the general population. Yet these exceptions number in the thousands, span multiple continents, and all date to the same narrow historical window. What if the headless burials were an attempt to hide the most obvious evidence of this size disparity? Human skulls don't lie. Measure a skull, and you can determine with reasonable accuracy the size of the individual, their ancestry, their approximate age, and numerous other characteristics that modern forensic science can extract. Remove the skulls, and you remove the most damning evidence that the bodies buried in the early 19th century belonged to a population genetically distinct from the one that replaced them. You remove the proof that giants, or at least a significantly larger human variant, walked the earth in living memory and then vanished, their disappearance carefully obscured by systematic mutilation of their remains. The chronology becomes even more suspicious when you examine global patterns. The headless burials peak during the same narrow window when other anomalous events cluster. The year without a summer in 1816, supposedly caused by a volcanic eruption, yet accompanied by reports of strange atmospheric phenomena, unusual celestial observations, and weather patterns that don't quite match volcanic winter expectations. Massive cholera pandemics that spread with impossible speed given the official transportation technology of the era. Simultaneous revolutions and political upheavals across continents that somehow coordinated despite supposedly primitive communication systems. It's as if the entire world experienced a synchronized crisis, a global catastrophe that official history has fragmented into disconnected regional events to obscure the unified nature of what actually happened. Drilling deeper into the 1816 anomaly reveals inconsistencies that should trouble anyone paying attention. The official explanation attributes the year without a summer to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, a volcanic event that supposedly ejected enough ash into the atmosphere to block sunlight globally. Yet contemporary accounts describe not just cold temperatures and crop failures, but phenomena that volcanic ash cannot explain. Unusual coloration of the sky lasting for months, reported as deep reds and purples rather than the grey associated with ash clouds. Magnetic disturbances that caused compass needles to spin wildly or point in wrong directions, reports of livestock behaving strangely, mass bird deaths, and unusual aurora displays at latitudes where they'd never been observed. These sound less like volcanic aftermath, and more like the planet had been subjected to some kind of electromagnetic or atmospheric weapon, something that disrupted weather patterns, damaged crops, and potentially exposed populations to harmful radiation or energy fields. And what happened to all those heads? Thousands upon thousands of skulls, carefully removed from burial grounds across the world, vanishing without trace. No anatomical collections large enough to account for them. No mass burial sites discovered containing just skulls. No documentation of where they went or why they were taken. They simply disappeared into the same void that swallowed so much evidence from that era. The pre-1800 maps showing different continental configurations, the advanced technical manuals that surviving fragments suggest once existed, the comprehensive genealogical records that would trace populations back beyond the convenient reset point, the architectural plans that might explain how supposedly primitive societies built structures modern engineers struggle to understand. Consider the implications if we accept even a fraction of this evidence at face value. It means the early 1800s marked not just a political or social transition, but a biological one, a demographic replacement event disguised as ordinary historical progression. It means the populations inhabiting Earth today are not direct descendants of those who built the great cities and monuments we attribute to the 18th and early 19th centuries. Or if we are descendants, we're a diminished remnant, smaller in stature, reduced in capability, inheritors of structures and systems we can maintain but not replicate. It means someone, some organization or authority with global reach, orchestrated a systematic cover-up, removing physical evidence, altering records, burying entire city districts under new construction, and decapitating thousands of corpses to prevent future generations from discovering the truth about who came before. The medical literature from the period, what survives unedited, contains references that modern scholars dismiss as superstition or metaphor, but read literally, they describe something far more disturbing. Physicians writing about treating patients with ancient constitution, about anatomical variations from the new stock, about genetic degradation, and the dying out of the old bloodlines. These aren't poetic flourishes. These are clinical observations from trained medical professionals who were witnessing in real time the disappearance of one human variant and its replacement by another. And they were documenting it in language that later editors would interpret as mystical nonsense, ensuring their testimony would be dismissed rather than investigated. One particularly revealing account comes from a Scottish physician practicing in Edinburgh during the 1820s. He maintained detailed case notes on patients he described as belonging to the elder race, individuals whose physical characteristics set them apart from what he termed common stock. These patients, he noted, demonstrated unusual resistance to certain diseases, particularly respiratory infections that ravaged the general population. They healed from injuries with remarkable speed, showed bone density significantly above normal, and possessed cardiovascular systems that functioned with unusual efficiency. Yet despite these apparent advantages, they were dying out, succumbing to what the physician called a wasting sickness that no treatment could address, as if their bodies were simply incompatible with the changing environment, or perhaps something in the atmosphere or food supply was specifically targeting their unique physiology. The religious dimension adds another layer of complexity. The headless burials received Christian funeral rites, suggesting church authorities not only permitted but participated in these practices. Yet nowhere in theological writings from the period do we find justification for mutilating corpses. Quite the opposite. Christian doctrine emphasized bodily resurrection, the importance of intact remains for the afterlife. The churches burying headless bodies were violating their own fundamental teachings and doing so systematically without apparent theological crisis or reform movements demanding explanation. Unless the church hierarchy understood something the general population didn't, unless they were complicit in a campaign to erase evidence of the previous civilization, willing to compromise their own doctrines to support a larger agenda of historical amnesia. What could have caused such a civilization-wide collapse? What could have killed off or driven away a population large enough to inhabit all these oversized structures, only to be replaced by smaller, less technologically capable successors? The official history offers gradual progress, societies slowly advancing from primitive to modern, technology incrementally improving, populations growing as agriculture and medicine developed. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Advanced capabilities lost, massive infrastructure abandoned or buried, genetic lineages disappearing, and a desperate scramble to occupy and maintain structures the new inhabitants didn't fully understand. Some researchers point to evidence of global catastrophe around the turn of the 19th century, ash layers in geological cores suggesting massive fires, atmospheric disturbances recorded in tree rings and ice cores, sudden climate shifts that official science attributes to volcanic activity, but which might have had more complex causes. Others note the peculiar reorganization of global power structures during this period, the emergence of new international banking systems, the simultaneous industrialization of multiple regions that had supposedly been pre-industrial just decades earlier, as if someone were rolling out a new economic and technological paradigm across the entire world, according to a coordinated plan. The banking systems deserve particular scrutiny because their sudden appearance and rapid global expansion during precisely this period defies the official narrative of gradual institutional development. Within a span of 20 to 30 years, international financial networks emerged that could coordinate loans, manage currencies, and facilitate transactions across continents with efficiency that supposedly primitive communication systems couldn't support. These institutions arrived with sophisticated accounting methods, complex financial instruments, and organizational structures that should have required centuries of evolution to develop, yet appeared fully formed as if transplanted from somewhere else, as if the architects of the new order needed financial control mechanisms in place before proceeding with their population replacement program. The headless burials might have been just one component of a much larger operation. Erase the genetic evidence, bury the architectural evidence, rewrite the documentary evidence, and present the surviving population with a new origin story that positioned them as the pinnacle of human development rather than diminished remnants of something greater. Create a history where progress moves linearly forward, where each generation is more advanced than the last, where the past was primitive and the future bright, rather than acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that human civilization has experienced catastrophic resets, that we've climbed to great heights before and fallen, that the magnificent structures surrounding us in older cities weren't built by our ancestors gradually learning and improving, but by a different people altogether, a people who knew things we've forgotten, who possessed capabilities we've lost, who were physically and perhaps mentally distinct from the populations that replaced them. The cover-up, if that's what this was, has been remarkably successful. Mention headless burials in the 19th century, and most historians will shrug, point to a few scattered criminal cases, perhaps reference anatomical trade, and move on without seeing the pattern. Suggest that these represent evidence of population replacement, genetic cleansing, or civilization reset, and you'll be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, someone unable to accept the straightforward explanation that these were unrelated anomalies, local problems, nothing suggesting coordination or deeper meaning. The fact that this dismissal comes so quickly that mainstream academia refuses to even examine the clustering patterns, the timeline correlations, the scale of the phenomenon, perhaps tells us everything we need to know about how deeply the historical cover-up has succeeded. We live in cities built for different inhabitants, follow customs whose origins we've forgotten, operate under economic and political systems whose establishment coincided suspiciously with the disappearance of the old population, and remain largely unaware that just 2 centuries ago something fundamental changed about human civilization and who inhabits it. The headless burials are a glimpse behind the curtain, a momentary revelation of the machinery by which history gets rewritten, evidence gets destroyed, and uncomfortable truths get buried alongside the decapitated remains of those who came before. They are the scars left by a process that wasn't quite thorough enough, the documentary remnants of an operation that succeeded in its larger goals but couldn't quite erase every trace of what it had done. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that if such a massive operation could be conducted successfully 200 years ago, if an entire previous civilization could be erased from memory, with only fragmentary clues surviving to suggest it ever existed, what's to say this hasn't happened before? What's to say the population replaced in the early 1800s wasn't itself a replacement for something earlier? How many times has human civilization climbed to great heights, achieved technological and architectural marvels, only to collapse or be deliberately destroyed? The survivors left to rebuild with diminished knowledge and altered memories, told they're primitives, advancing toward unprecedented achievement when they're actually remnants trying to recapture something lost. The headless burials might not be evidence of a singular event, but rather a glimpse of a recurring pattern, a cycle of rise and fall that we've been taught doesn't exist, that history is linear progression when it's actually circular catastrophe, each iteration forgetting the last, each new population building atop the buried ruins of its predecessors, never quite understanding that the magnificent structures they inhabit are inheritances from giants they've been taught never existed. The documentation that does survive from the transition period reveals a curious pattern of selective preservation. Government archives contain meticulous records of minor administrative details, tax collections, property transfers, routine correspondence about mundane matters, but ask for documentation about population demographics, about where exactly all these new citizens came from, about what happened to the previous inhabitants, about why major construction projects were undertaken, and you'll find those specific files are missing, damaged, or were never created in the first place. It's as if someone went through the archives with surgical precision, removing only those documents that might reveal the truth about the demographic transition while leaving everything else intact to create the illusion of thorough record-keeping. This selective destruction suggests sophisticated understanding of how future historians would work, what kinds of evidence they'd seek, and how to deny them that evidence while maintaining plausible deniability. The pattern extends beyond Europe and North America into regions we're told had no contact with Western civilization during this period. Colonial reports from administrators in India, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa describe discovering abandoned cities of enormous scale, built with engineering sophistication that local populations claimed preceded their own arrival by unknown spans of time. These weren't primitive ruins being discovered by advanced colonizers, as the official narrative suggests. These were advanced structures being encountered by populations who freely admitted they hadn't built them, that they'd found them already ancient, already partially buried, and simply moved into whatever remained habitable. The colonial administrators documented these accounts with obvious discomfort, noting the architectural similarities between these supposedly isolated ruins and the great European structures of the pre-1800 period, as if the same civilization, or at least the same architectural knowledge, had once spanned the globe before vanishing almost simultaneously across all continents. And wherever these ruins appeared, local burial grounds from the transition period showed the same phenomenon. Bodies interred without heads, the remains carefully mutilated in ways that prevented future identification or analysis of who these people had been. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire mystery is how thoroughly it's been normalized. Walk into any museum with pre-1800 collections, and you'll find curators casually mentioning that certain skeletal remains show unusual characteristics, that some burial sites contain incomplete remains, that documentation from the period is frustratingly sparse on certain topics. They present these anomalies as minor footnotes, interesting quirks that don't warrant deeper investigation. But stand back and look at the full picture. Connect all these isolated anomalies into a coherent pattern, and what emerges is evidence of systematic evidence destruction on a scale that should terrify anyone who values historical truth. We're not talking about natural decay or random loss. We're looking at coordinated, deliberate erasure of an entire civilization's physical remains, carried out with resources and organization that supposedly didn't exist in that era, executed with precision that suggests those doing the erasing understood exactly what future technologies might reveal and took steps to prevent those revelations. The headless burials were insurance, a failsafe to ensure that even if bodies were eventually exhumed and analyzed with advanced forensic techniques, the most revealing evidence, the skulls that might prove these were genetically distinct populations, would be gone, leaving only questions that mainstream science would be reluctant to pursue. So the next time you walk past one of those impossibly grand buildings constructed in the early 1800s, the ones with doorways built for giants and infrastructure that modern engineers struggle to explain, remember that you're not looking at the work of your ancestors slowly learning to master their environment. You're looking at the remnants of a previous civilization, occupied by a replacement population that inherited structures they didn't build, using systems they didn't fully understand, living atop burial grounds filled with headless corpses, whose removal was deemed necessary to prevent future generations from asking uncomfortable questions about who really built the world we inhabit. The official history is a carefully constructed lie. The headless burials are proof that someone went to extraordinary lengths to maintain that lie, and we continue living within that deception generation after generation, never quite remembering what was taken from us, never quite understanding that we're not the inheritors of primitive ancestors who gradually improved, but the diminished descendants of something far greater that someone decided we weren't meant to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most disturbing mysteries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never accept the official story when the evidence suggests something far more profound lies hidden beneath the surface. So the next time you walk past one of those impossibly grand buildings constructed in the early 1800s, the ones with doorways built for giants and infrastructure that modern engineers struggle to explain, remember that you're not looking at the work of your ancestors slowly learning to master their environment. You're looking at the remnants of a previous civilization, occupied by a replacement population that inherited structures they didn't build, using systems they didn't fully understand, living atop burial grounds filled with headless corpses whose removal was deemed necessary to prevent future generations from asking uncomfortable questions about who really built the world we inhabit. The official history is a carefully constructed lie. The headless burials are proof that someone went to extraordinary lengths to maintain that lie, and we continue living within that deception, generation after generation, never quite remembering what was taken from us, never quite understanding that we're not the inheritors of primitive ancestors who gradually improved, but the diminished descendants of something far greater that someone decided we weren't meant to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most disturbing mysteries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never accept the official story when the evidence suggests something far more profound lies hidden beneath the surface.